All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Jason Richards. I am past Master Vacation Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, a member of the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in Washington, D.C. And just wanted to say thanks so much for joining me just to talk a little bit about Masonic research today. So I'm joined by some awesome people on both Zoom and the YouTube channel. So thank you so much for coming and spending a little bit of time with me tonight. So let me get the slides up and running and we'll kick things off. So for those of you who don't know me, put the slide, oh, come on. There we go. For those of you who don't know me, I do a little bit of a show called the Masonic Roundtable. And we're a weekly podcast on YouTube, and we just talk about Masonic topics every single week, ranging from philosophy to history to research and just symbolism, esoterics, everything in between. And my passion has been history for the longest time. It's one of the reasons why I got into Freemasonry, was because it goes back at least 5 generations of my family. As best I can tell, that's as far as I've been able to trace it back. And so I really have a historical connection to the fraternity. And so having been a history major in college, I absolutely love doing historical research. And I'm really fascinated with just the history of Freemasonry in general, because it's so interesting, and we as historians know so little about it. But one of the questions I get a whole lot from really Masons who are brand new to the fraternity to those who have been in for 40 years is how do you do research, and how do you even start? How do you begin? What do you need to look out for? How could I ever do what you do? On a weekly basis, researching new topics for shows. And so my point in all of this is to try to demystify the research process. And it's not this this program isn't for those scholars who are regularly publishing in AQC and things like that, but this program is really a 101 research methodology course, just for folks who are interested in figuring out where to start and how to actually contribute their own unique perspective and knowledge to the realm of Masonic education. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So first point of research is tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them, and then tell them what you told them. There are 3 things to remember. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and that's starting with the agenda. So we'll go through a little bit of an introduction, the whys and whats of Masonic education. What is Masonic education? Why do we emphasize Masonic education? Just have a little discussion on that. Then we'll talk about different levels of research, and these are specifically 2 different levels that are very prominent in Masonic scholarship and Masonic writing today. And then we'll go through step by step the actual research process, from picking out a topic all the way through doing your final paper or presentation. One thing that we're going to spend a little bit of time on tonight, which I think is so critical, is the availability of sources on the internet and how we actually vet them. How do we know if the source is credible, is accurate, can be corroborated? We have a couple little tricks that we can do, a couple questions we can ask to just spend 5 or 10 minutes max applying some critical thinking to the sources that we find publicly available on the internet, to figure out whether or not we should use those sources in our research, or how we should use those sources in our research. And then we'll finish off with the conclusion that I hope everybody takes away from this, is that anyone can contribute original thought and make an original contribution to Masonic education. And I think everybody should. But getting into the whys and whats of Masonic education, why do we do Masonic education? There's a question that's asked, what did you come here to do? And Masonic education really, to me, is how we improve ourselves in Masonry. It is a way for us to better ourselves as men and Masons, and by increasing our own knowledge, we're able to understand more of the world around us. We're able to understand the world around us from a different perspective, whether it be culturally, or politically, or what have you. And Masonic education really can open us up to diverse perspectives, new ways of thinking, and that's so critically important, especially in today's world when we live in just a very polarized right versus left society. You know, it's important to be able to take a look at things from multiple perspectives and multiple world views, not necessarily to come around and agree with other folks, but to perhaps see where other folks are coming from, and see that as kind of a driver for their actions. It just helps us make ourselves into better people. And you know, Freemasonry makes good men better, and this, to me, Masonic education is how we make ourselves better. One of several main ways in this fraternity that we do that. So what exactly is Masonic education? When I was thinking about this and putting this together, I realized that it's much easier to express Masonic education in terms of what it isn't, vice what it is, because Masonic education encompasses so much. Masonic history and symbolism and the tenets of Freemasonry and the philosophy of Freemasonry is so rich with historical nuggets and philosophies and goodies, everything from Enlightenment philosophy to the 7 liberal arts and sciences, to ancient religions and philosophical orders. Freemasonry has all of that wrapped in it, and all of that can be researched and can be codified under this big umbrella of Masonic education. In Virginia, we have it codified really what isn't. I'm taking this out of you know, one of the big awards that we have in Virginia called the Hillman Award, where you actually you know, can get an award for doing a bunch of different things, including a section on Masonic education. So Masonic education, according to Virginia at least, is not ritual work. Now, you know, you can dissect the ritual and you can look at the historical usages and context and the etymologies of certain words, and that's fine for Masonic education. But just rote, you know, ritual memorization doesn't cut it as far as Virginia is concerned. And then you know, we've all been in lodges where the master brings in, you know, a phenomenal program on, you know, the Boy Scouts of America. Or, you know, we at my lodge at Acacia, you know, we had a urologist come in a number of years before I even got there, to talk about prostate cancer. Really interesting, really useful program, because I heard about it when I was, you know, going through the degrees, and that, you know, that was like 2 years gone and people were still remembering it. But those civic and otherwise educational programs that are unrelated to Freemasonry, while they have value and can contribute a lot of value to your brethren, in Virginia, it doesn't specifically qualify as Masonic education. So, you know, when we talk about Masonic education, we talk about everything else, whether it's the history of Freemasonry, the pendant bodies, different rites and degrees and rituals and philosophies and education and esoteric philosophies. That's all covered. And really, the world is your oyster as far as Masonic education research is concerned. That's another thing that I want to foot stomp here, is that there's so much out there that you can research under the guise of Masonic education that you shouldn't ever get bored. If anything, you know, the main trouble I think folks really have is figuring out what exactly to start researching. So let's talk a little bit about just some prepackaged education sources. There is a lot of amazing Masonic education and Masonic resources out on the internet today. Um, and you know, everything from podcasts to magazines to PDFs of Wilmshurst and Mackey and Gould. We are living in an unprecedented era of Masonic educational availability on the internet. So you know, you don't have to go to the House of the Temple Library or to your Grand Lodge Library in order to get some quality Masonic educational sources anymore. Now, they still have an amazing selection of Masonic educational sources, but increasingly today, with the advent of good Masonic research, as well as the digitizing effort that a lot of Grand Lodges and other places are going through to digitize all of these old, out of print, out of copyright books like Mackey's History of Freemasonry. We have so much available to us on our fingertips, or at our fingertips. And you know, most importantly, I just want to foot stomp the fact that, you know, when you're taking Masonic education to your lodge, or you're sharing Masonic education with your brothers, it doesn't have to involve original research. There's nothing wrong with taking something that you got from a podcast, or you know, perhaps as an article that Robert Johnson read on Whence Came You, and you want to send that article around to your lodge brethren, and then have, you know, a 20 to 30-minute discussion on that. That's perfectly fine. And you know, we've had a number of folks over the past 6 years, you know, contact us at the Masonic Roundtable and say, hey, I want to show, you know, part of your episode in lodge. Is that okay? And our answer 100 times out of 100 is yes, absolutely. That's what we're here for. If it can spark a discussion and a learning experience with your brethren, then just have at it. So, you know, as you're scratching your head trying to bring Masonic education to your brethren, just remember, you don't have to come up with something new. It's okay to use the good work that's already out there. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can figure out what's good and what's not. All right, levels of research. And this isn't exhaustive, but when you look at Masonic scholarship today, and books that are being put out by Masons, they predominantly fall into two categories as far as research goes. You have anecdotal or experiential research, and you have empirical and data-driven research. So when you talk about anecdotal or experiential research, that's research based on personal experience. I liken this to the book Freemasonry in Black and White by Charles Harper, where he details his experience with clandestine Freemasonry and how he made that transition from being a clandestine Mason to being an AF and AM Grand Lodge Mason. And that's based purely on his own experiences. And that's a fantastic way to write a book. If it's based on your own experiences and your own anecdotes, you know, there's definitely a place for that in research and scholarship. But the next level down, where I think a lot of our scholarly research comes into play, is empirical and or data-driven research. So we look at the work that John Ruark has been doing with statistical analysis of membership data and the decline of Freemasonry. That is empirical data-driven analysis. You look at the work that Mark Tabbert has done with George Washington as a Freemason. Mark is actually he's working as a fellow at Mount Vernon now, studying George Washington, and he's combing through George Washington's personal anecdotes and journals and primary source documentation, compiling that and putting his own analysis on that. So that even though he's using anecdotes, personal anecdotes from George Washington, he applying that critical thinking research and corroboration to those primary sources makes that really an empirical work of research. And so, I want to foot stomp, I'm not casting shade or saying that one is better than the other. You just want to know when to use one versus the other. If you're conveying a personal experience, and saying, this is my experience, no one else's, that, anecdotal research is a great thing to do. But if you're trying to make a cohesive, constructive argument built on, primary source documentation and data and statistics, you're going to have a stronger argument if you base that off of, hard data vice simply just personal experience. And over time, anecdotes or collections of anecdotes become in and of themselves data. If you're writing a paper from your own point of view, that is one single data point. Whereas if you look over the vast history of, a sample size of 100 different people who all have, a shared experience or describe an experience in the same way, then you're getting more into data analysis. So just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the differences between anecdotal and empirical research, because you see those both a lot in Masonic books that are published today. So before you begin, when you're looking at a topic and trying to figure out what to research and how to even start, it's so important that you find something that you're going to be interested in. There are so many times when I've sat down to start researching something or writing something, and I pick a topic because I think it'll be cool, or I think people will want to research it or read about it, and it's just dull as dirt. And it just makes it that much harder to be disciplined about researching it or writing it. So if you have something that you're passionate about, something that you're really interested in and you want to learn more about, pick that and do research on that and work that into a presentation or a paper. You're gonna be so much happier. You're gonna be so much more disciplined and so much more energized about the research you're doing, because research is work. And if you're miserable about the topic, in addition to doing the work, you're just going to have a hard time. So there's so much that you can research in Freemasonry. Just pick something that you like. All right, so let's talk about the research process itself. The first thing that I like to do when I think about, oh man, I should probably do some research, or oh, I should probably come up with another presentation, or oh, AMD, I need to pick a paper topic. What you should really do after you pick a paper topic or find something you're interested in, you should start by identifying a research goal. It helps for you to give a general bound to the scope of your research. And you can do this, generally speaking, without doing any work ahead of time. You just want to figure out what do I want to get out of this research process? Do I just want to learn more information? Do I want to write a paper? Do I want to give a presentation? How long of a presentation? How long of a paper? No, I don't know. Come up with just a general, it can be like 1 or 2 sentences of a research goal, going, okay, in researching the sprig of acacia, I want to be able to have a 5-page paper come out of it and a 10-minute presentation that I can give in lodge. Okay, great. That kind of bounds your scope and gives you something to shoot for. And because if you go into researching something, leaving it wide open, it gets very overwhelming very quickly. And so I've found that by bounding things up front, you can always expand that bound out. Like if it's turning into a 10-page paper, that's fine. But at the outset, just scope it down to something that you're comfortable with, so that you don't get discouraged and you don't get overwhelmed. Some examples: you could want to do enough research to have a short presentation to give in lodge. You could be looking to write a paper that you could publish in a lodge dress award or on the Midnight Freemasons or someplace like that. Or honestly, you could just be looking for a broad overview of the topic that gives you enough information to be able to lead a discussion, a virtual discussion or something like that. It really, again, it's as much or as little as you want to do, and it's truly you, because research ends and begins with you. So it needs to be something that you're interested in and a goal that you're happy about setting. So once you've identified your research goal, it's important to start broad, especially when you don't have a lot of detailed knowledge or foreknowledge on a given topic. Folks who are seasoned researchers are going to scream at me for this, but Wikipedia is a phenomenal resource to give you a very broad 100,000-foot overview of a given topic. You don't take it word for word, and you recognize that it's a crowdsourced encyclopedia, so it might not be 100% accurate, probably isn't. But if you're looking just for that broad brush overview to give you a general concept for the big parts of your research topic and your research paper, Wikipedia is a great resource. Another great resource, I'm going to share a little bit of TMR trade secrets with you. Another great resource is Mackey's Encyclopedia and Gould's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. When we start researching for a show, there are so many times when I'll go back to my bookcase there and I'll pull out Mackey's or Gould's or Coyle's Masonic Encyclopedia and just read some of the entries on our subject matter, because that gives me ideas to delve deeper into my research. You can use Grand Lodge resources as well. Grand Lodge of Ohio has a great online educational center. Your Grand Lodge, chances are your Grand Lodge has some sort of repository of papers or educational resources. Go and take a look at those. And again, just as you're doing this, just try to get a feel for the broad concepts related to your research topic. You don't have to dive into the nitty gritty. You just want to get an overall picture of what you're looking at from a research standpoint. The other reason why Wikipedia is awesome is because of the source citations. You scroll down to the end of a Wikipedia page and all of the footnotes with links often to the actual sources that were used are there. And so when you go from really broad down to really narrow, those are all things that you can pick at and all in-depth sources that you can use to narrow your focus. Once you've got a broad overview of your topic and your focus, then you'll want to actually narrow it down. And so we do this by constraining our research and looking into more specialized sources. So remember, at the last slide, we were talking about Wikipedia and Masonic encyclopedias. Those are great for, mile wide and inch deep Masonic research efforts. But ultimately, you're going to want to have something of substance. And for that, you're going to need to use more specialized search engines and more specialized sources. So you'll want to take some time to actually constrain your research down. So you want to, there's a technique called mind mapping that we're going to go through on the next slide as a way to narrow your focus down and constrain your research about your topic to just what you want to focus on. As you do this, once you constrain that topic, you'll want to consult specialized search engines. You can do things like Google Scholar, which is scholar.google.com is great. It links to peer-reviewed articles only and scholarly articles only, most of which you have to pay for. But there are some PDFs out there that you can find that are, again, most all of them are peer-reviewed and go very, very in-depth into your topic. If you're looking for primary sources, you can go to the old charges. Now, primary sources and secondary sources, that's kind of historian and history major lingo. Primary sources are the original text, George Washington's journal, the old charges. Secondary sources are Mark Tabert's book about George Washington that he wrote based on George Washington's own personal memoirs. The difference is, how many levels of analysis have the sources gone through before you read them. So primary sources, you're the first one doing analysis on these sources. Secondary sources, you're reading someone else's analysis about the sources. And again, it's not, one's not better than the other. It's just you have to understand the nuanced differences between them in order to be able to use them appropriately and recognize when the author may have some bias, or how you need to treat a source in a certain way to make sure that you're accounting for bias and lack of information and things like that. Another great research paper repository is JSTOR. JSTOR. It saved my life a bunch of times in college, and because of the current pandemic, JSTOR has actually expanded their article access to everybody who can get 100 articles free right now during the pandemic. I think it's usually only like 3 or 4. So that's a great place to find really amazing peer-reviewed journal articles that go very, very much in depth and into detail in all sorts of different subjects, Masonic and not. So let's talk about how we get from the 100,000 foot overview to right over top of the subject matter that you're actually interested in. And this is one technique that you can use to do that. And it's something that I really like, because it's a way for you to take a bunch of abstract concepts and lay them out visually. So it triggers the other part of your brain and enables you to see your subject matter with a different perspective. So it's called mind mapping. So I am researching my favorite symbol, the sprig of acacia. I absolutely love the sprig of acacia. I'm from Acacia Lodge. I would love to do a research paper on it. So what I'm going to do is what I'm going to do is mute all the participants. There we go. Let me get back to the screen share. There we go. So what I want to do is write a paper on the sprig of acacia. All right, so of course, the first thing that I know I need to write about is the symbolism. You know, Masonry is just rich in symbolism. So I just make a box out to the left of the sprig of acacia and draw an arrow connecting sprig of acacia to symbolism. You know, I bet you the sprig of acacia comes up in the Old Testament. You know, a lot of the Masonic rituals are based heavily in Old Testament, you know, mythology. So let's see if we can find any biblical references that call out the sprig of acacia. Well, of course, you know, I know about the sprig of acacia because we use it in the Masonic ritual. So I wonder how long it's been there. I wonder if the usage has changed at all. Yeah, let's talk about its usage in ritual. Okay, that sounds good. And you know, there's something about the sprig of acacia that I've never really researched before, and that's the actual like biology of the plant. Like where does it come from? How long has it been around? Does it have any defining biological characteristics that would make somebody like Desagoulier want to put it into you know, a Masonic ritual? I don't know. So let's talk a little bit about the biology. All right, so for going back to symbolism, all right, we know that acacia, you know, is a symbol of, you know, the immortality of the soul, death, resurrection. Let's put all those down. There we go. Now we've mapped out to those. As far as biblical references are concerned, well, you know, it's interesting. The Ark of the Covenant was supposedly made of acacia wood, and then you know, you've got some sources that have speculated that the burning bush was acacia, and the tabernacle was supposedly built out of acacia. So yeah, let's put those there too. And now you're seeing visually all of the disparate pieces of information that you pulled together in your 100,000 foot overview research project. As far as the usages and ritual, well, how would we know if you know, if the sprig of acacia had you know, different usages 300 years ago than today? Well, you'd probably want to look at some of the exposés that were published in the 18th century. specifically probably Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, which gives the first contemporary account of the third degree legend as we know it today. Probably want to take a look at the use of the acacia on tracing boards, because we have a lot of different tracing boards that kind of trace out Masonic symbolism throughout history. And you may want to think about acacia as far as how it relates to the initiatic experience, and may want to take a look at its evolution in the current modern Preston Webb ritual that a lot of Grand Lodges in the United States use. Cool. Well, let's take a look at biology. Yeah, that's interesting. The acacia was actually native to Australia and Africa, and not necessarily the Middle East. Yet it shows up in a story about King Solomon's temple. Okay, that's interesting. Oh, and I was reading this guy, P.D. Newman, who actually talks about the history of the acacia as an entheogenic compound, which is a hallucinogenic substance that was used in rituals and religious ceremonies to enable a heightened state of consciousness, a temporary heightened state of consciousness. All right, so here is my mind map of my sprig of acacia paper. Interestingly enough, this isn't a, these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can see that, oh, interestingly enough, there's been some research that has postulated that the burning bush may have actually been, made of acacia, may have been an entheogenic compound that induced a hallucination that the bush was burning. That's interesting. Well, wait a minute. If you're a Yorkite Mason, you know all about the Ark of the Covenant and how we use that in some rituals. Tie that together. Tracing boards are all about Masonic symbolism, so they tie back to Masonic symbolism. And then we do know that Desaguliers was a member of the Royal Society, which had dealings with entheogenic compounds, to include acacia, which could have been used in the earliest Masonic rituals to heighten the initiatic experience. So, so as you're drawing these lines here and there, you start to see a really, really interesting picture of the research that you've done so far. And then, based on your research goal, how long you want the paper to be and how much you want to do, you can start biting off different pieces of this piece by piece. And you can choose which parts you want to focus on and narrow your focus by just tossing out, whole subjects or whole sub-subjects. So the next part of your research outline, as soon as you kind of narrow your focus and figure out what you want to do, is to make an outline and fill it in. And it's important, again, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. Outline always needs to begin with an introduction and end with a conclusion. And the everything in between is you actually telling them. It's important to work incrementally. Don't try to boil the ocean with your research, because you're going to burn yourself out. A great part about doing mind mapping and outline exercises, as we'll see, is you can actually bite off little pieces here and there. And for someone like me who loves who gets a lot of pleasure out of checking boxes, it's great for me to be able to fill in an outline kind of one section at a time and just kind of check those boxes off. It makes me feel very accomplished. It makes me feel like I've got something to show for my research. And then as you work incrementally and modularly, you tie those sections together with transitions. So this is something that I probably didn't learn how to do really well until maybe my first year of grad school. I had the hardest time, and my professors harped on me a lot about my weak transitions and my lack of transitions. It's very jarring to your reader or to your listener when you go from one subject and just do a 180 turn and go down another road or another path without directing them to where you're going. So you could be talking about, and so, the sprig of the acacia was used as the wood for the tabernacle, and oh, now we're on to tracing boards. Whereas you could say something like, now that we've examined the biblical relationship between the Old Testament and the sprig of acacia, let's turn our attention to the symbolism of the acacia as evidenced in 18th century trestle board or 18th century tracing boards. And it's just a way for you to kind of guide your listener and your reader's attention so they don't get whiplash or get confused by just a jarring transition. And so you want to put some good transitions into your paper to just kind of guide that reader so that it makes it easier for them to follow and easier for them to flow. And you'll really want to use transitions, especially if you're trying to make kind of a persuasive argument or write a thesis. There are different things that you can do when there are different purposes for writing papers and writing presentations. It could be simply to inform your brethren of something. It could be to lead a discussion or facilitate. It could also be, the purpose could also be to persuade. And when you're looking at at making your research goal, it's important to figure out, how you want to convey that information to other people and what your purpose in conveying that information is. Whether you're simply trying to inform them, whether you're trying to persuade them of a hypothesis or an argument, or whether it's really just background information to facilitate a bigger discussion. And your transitional phrases will vary and differ based on the purpose of the paper. So let's talk about our sprig of acacia paper outline. So I've gone ahead and I've made my outline and I'm ready to start filling it in piece by piece by piece, a little bit at a time. So I've got an introduction. It's supposed to catch the reader or the listener's attention and bring them in as you tell them what they're going to be spending, their next couple minutes either reading or listening to. We're going to start with symbolism. So we're going to talk about death, resurrection, and immortality of the soul. Then we're going to transition them over to the usage, its usage and ritual. We're going to start by, again, examining the symbolism in tracing boards because that ties back to the preceding section of the paper on symbolism. And we're going to take a look at the tracing boards throughout history and how it's changed. And then we can take a look at the actual ritual itself and see how that's changed. So we're going to start with those oldest exposés, Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, The Mystery of Masonry. There are a bunch of exposés that were written throughout the 1700s, just detailing Masonic ritual and putting it out there for the public. Then we can get to the modern ritual, Preston Webb. And then we can, go from there and talk about, sprig of acacia as part of the initiatic experience. And with Desaguliers and the Royal Society, lean on P.D. Newman's work on acacia as an entheogenic compound, whatever have you, excuse me. And then sum it up together, wrap it up in a nice bow with the conclusion. And it's essentially, telling them what you told them, plus an ending that kind of ties it all together. And it doesn't have to be more than a sentence, really. Just kind of giving them that last taste of that Masonic education. And if you take a look at this outline, you'll see some major similarities to our mind map. Like literally, I took boxes from the mind map and put them wholesale into the outline and just arranged them in a way that makes sense. And now, I can start researching things like, death, the resurrection, and immortality of the soul as symbolism as it relates to the sprig of acacia. Start filling those things out. What I usually do when I write a paper is I will put the outline up top, and then I will copy it again, and I will actually start writing prose and sources and text under each of those different bullet points to literally fill in the outline. And so as you see that outline diminish, you see the paper take shape. And to me, that's just incredibly satisfying. as a researcher. Of course, once you delete all the outline stuff out of it, you'll need to go back through, make sure the order makes sense, make sure you have really good transitions in there, and make sure the paper just flows consistently. And that's all stuff you'll have to do after you fill that in. After you've gone through and you think it's just about ready, it is so incredibly important to take a break from it. You have spent so much time with this paper or presentation. You're kind of blind to it at this point in time. And the easiest way to break that blindness is to just walk away from it. I say 24 hours minimum. If it's a longer paper or a longer presentation, take 3 days, 4 days. Just put it down, come back to it the next week. You will be amazed at all of the inconsistencies, grammatical errors, and what have you that you will find when you come back to a paper after taking a big break from it. I have literally sat down to papers after taking a break from them when I thought they were done, and I'll just look at it, shake my head, and go, what the hell was I thinking? And if you're not confident of your own ability to do that, you can get your brothers to do it for you. Another great way to proofread is to get a trusted brother or two to look it over. They have their own perspectives. They have their own biases, and you might have your blinders on to a certain way that your writing comes off, or a certain source that you used that's actually been discredited. Your brothers might have information on a better source to use. They might have information on a better way to state something. You might just have a problem being clear, and they might just say, I don't understand this, can you please clarify? Well, I've done all the research. I can make leaps in my head, logical leaps in my head that connect my ideas, but someone who's looking at this without all that research, it might be too difficult for them to follow. They might not have that information to connect those gaps. And that is why it's so important to get somebody else to proofread your paper for you. As you do this, the best proofreaders are the ones who just rip your paper to shreds and are brutally honest. I have had some brethren some folks throughout my career where I've said, hey, would you please take this and proofread it? And they'll give it back to me a day later and they say, it was great, no changes. And you know what? I will never, ever use them as a proofreader again, because that didn't give me anything it's highly unlikely that my paper was so awesome that nobody had anything to say about it. But the folks who just rip it to shreds and redline everything, and are correct in their comments, there has to be, there has to be some helpfulness there as well, are the ones who I'll go back to time and time again to say, hey, please give this a sanity check and a proofread for me. And it's very important when you get that criticism back to not take it personally. They are not attacking you. They are trying to help you make it better. With that, you also shouldn't feel obligated to make the changes your proofreaders recommend. Make all the changes your proofreaders recommend. It's your paper. It's your baby. Ultimately, you're the one whose name is on it. So if your proofreaders, come back with something and you really just disagree, okay, don't use it. But remember, if you fail to make a change and it comes out being wrong, you just have to take ownership of that. But it's a learning process, and we all grow, and as you research over time, you're going to get better and better and better, and more assertive and more confident in your research. And the quote at the bottom of the slide is something that one of my thesis advisors for my undergrad history thesis always told me. He said, "He who writes the most drafts wins." And while I like to agree with that in sentiments, pragmatically, at some point you just have to say it's good enough, we're done, move on. So he who writes a number of drafts as opposed to just one most certainly wins. But he who writes all the drafts and never finishes, well, never actually has a paper to present. So try to balance your time and make a make a judgment call there. And finally, the last thing for you to do is to share that Masonic education and that Masonic knowledge with your brothers. It's a way for you to help them better themselves, learn something new, learn something old from a different perspective, learn something new from a different perspective. Again, Masonic education is how we improve ourselves mentally and how we improve ourselves in Masonry. So don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your brethren, with anybody who wants to listen, because anybody can and should make an important contribution to the field of Masonic education. So we've talked a little bit about the research process, the levels of research. Now let's segue into all of the sources and all the information that's readily available on the internet. It is so, we live in such an amazing time right now. There is so much information and good information readily available on the internet, between the advent of good quality Masonic podcasts and YouTube videos, to online publications, to the effort to digitize primary sources and older Masonic authors. There's just so much information that you can tap into on the internet. And if you just take 5 minutes up front to apply some critical thinking to vet your internet sources, your research is just going to be all that much more stronger. And you're just going to have a much better argument and a much better paper if you try to understand where the sources are coming from, whether or not they're reputable, and why the authors wrote those particular sources. And it doesn't mean that a source is bad or a source is good, but if you know that an author is biased according to a certain way, you can account for that bias in your paper and use your source a different way than you would if you were just to take it at face value. And so when you use internet sources, or really any sources, don't just take it at face value. You have to understand the context, you have to understand the bias, and you can ask yourself a couple questions and do a little bit of extra research in order to figure those things out to give yourself a much better paper. Vetting internet sources. Internet's a wealth of knowledge, but how do we know if it's credible? What biases are present? Can the information presented be corroborated? Is it the only source that says this, or are there other people who have said the same thing? Where did those other people get those ideas from? They all get it from the first source, or did they get it from different sources? The more sources you have saying the same thing, the stronger your evidence. It gets you away from the anecdotal research and into the empirical or data-driven research. Has the author's thesis been widely disproven or accepted? If we're looking at Born in Blood by John J. Robinson, which is a phenomenal book, just incredibly entertaining, that author's thesis has more or less widely been disproven at this point, that the Masons sprouted out from the Knights Templar. You shouldn't necessarily take that as a gospel source and write a paper on the origins of Freemasonry, quoting John J. Robinson as gospel. By taking a few moments to exercise critical thinking, we can ensure that we're using sources appropriately. You can say, this is, John J. Robinson presents a very interesting approach to the origins of Freemasonry. It's not the only one. Here are some others. Here are the pros and cons of each. And here's what historical scholarship has to say. It's a much better paper and a much more well-rounded paper than just saying Freemasons came from the Knights Templar, end of discussion. All right, so first thing we want to take a look at when we're vetting internet sources, we need to ask the question, who wrote the article? Who wrote the paper? Is the author or organization listed? Is the author qualified to write on the topic? So you look at realitysandwich.com. Like, okay, I know nothing about this article. I know nothing about this website. It came up when I was researching the Sprig of Acacia. And wow, it's a Masonic webzine devoted to psychedelic culture. Okay, so probably fringe. Don't know how reputable this source is going to be. All right, who wrote this paper on the sprig of acacia? And it's an emblem of faith in the immortality of the soul. Oh, this was actually an article written by P.D. Newman about 7 years ago. Oh, okay. Well, I know P.D. Newman's other work, and I know what other people have said about P.D. Newman's work, including like Brent Morris and Art de Hoyos, who've spoken really, really highly of his work. So, I can probably trust this article, even though I haven't actually seen this website, and this website looks to be a bit fringe. So yeah, I'll trust but verify and see if the rest of the article makes sense, because I know the author. He's qualified to write on the topic. What's the purpose of the article or website? Masonic-lodge-of-education.com. This is another great resource if you want to go a mile wide and an inch deep on Freemasonry. It is a huge collection of articles on just about everything under the sun. It's very similar to phoenixmasonry.com, just amazing collection of articles. But should I use this to get really detailed information on my topic, or should I use it more to get a kind of a broad brush overview? Well, on the first page of MasonicLodgeOfEducation.com, the author and compiler and editor of the page gives a little introduction. Hello, my name is Simon Pierce, and I'd like to help you learn basic lodge level Freemasonry. Great, that's the purpose of the site. The purpose isn't to provide hugely in-depth, detailed scholarly works. Instead, it's providing a broad brush overview of a topic. So since I know the purpose of this site, I can then use this source appropriately to inform my early research gathering processes, as opposed to my latter constrained, more scholarly research processes later on in the research process. So it's really, really important to try to find out what you can about the site that the article is posted on, or the book is posted on, and its purpose. Is it trying to inform you? Is it trying to sell a product, enlighten, persuade, what have you? These are all things you need to take into account when you're taking a look at any source, much less a source on the internet. Objectivity. Is the information presented as fact? Is it opinion? Is it propaganda? Does the author have an organizational affiliation, or does the website have an organizational affiliation that might bias the information that it presents? I want to make sure you all know that biased information isn't necessarily bad or inherently bad. Everyone has a bias. When George Washington was writing his memoirs and his correspondence, he had a personal bias. But it's important to be able to recognize that bias, and again, not take the source as just face value as gospel. So this is actually an interesting article on Straight Answers, What Are the Masons, from my neck of the woods, Arlington, Virginia. And interestingly enough, it's a Roman Catholic publication, the Catholic Herald. That doesn't mean it's a bad article, but when it talks about the Q&A in that actual article and says that Freemasonry is really, really bad because they have secrets that they're holding, that the Catholic priests and Catholic Church can't know about, or you're swearing oaths to God, that gives me a little bit of an idea of where they're coming from based on their organizational affiliation, so that I can address that bias in my paper, or perhaps use this source in another way to illustrate perhaps popular objections to Freemasonry, or something along those lines. Biased sources aren't bad sources, but you have to know how to use them, and you can't take them at face value, which is why this is so important to vet your sources, especially online. 4, accuracy. Can you verify the sources that the author is using? Are the sources well documented? Are they well cited? Do you have in-text citations? Do you have endnotes? Do you have footnotes? Has the information been peer reviewed, which means it stood up to against other scholars who have reviewed it, vetted it, and said, yes, this is good stuff. Again, it's like corroborating information. The more sources that say, yeah, this is good stuff, who have the credentials to be able to validate and review that article, the stronger, the higher likelihood that it's a strong case to be used in your research. This is also important. Are grammatical errors and typos present? And you know, when it comes to being on social media and on the internet, if I see a huge block of text from someone who is super impassioned and making an argument, if there are typos and grammatical errors in that text, my own bias is that I immediately discount that author's entire thesis. Because to me, if that author didn't take the time to make sure that didn't do the work and take the time to make sure that his grammar and spelling was on point, then I see that as the easy stuff. The hard stuff is the logical analysis and applying the second and third, liberal arts and making a cohesive argument. So if you didn't do the easy stuff, to me, you're not going to put in that effort for a good logical argument and logical conclusion. So I just discount that almost immediately. I'm just being upfront and honest about my own personal bias and the fact that I don't have a lot of time to scroll through the internet to waste my time on a huge block of text that might not be relevant. Going back to, can the author's sources be verified? This is why it is so important to keep track of your sources that you've used so that other people can go to where you got your information, because it helps them assess the quality of your work. And it also helps use your work as a springboard for their own work. So if they know where you got the information, they can say, oh, well, the information says this, but he interpreted it this way. That's really interesting. You might have, opened up a new perspective to somebody that they can only figure out based on seeing the original text and then your interpretation of it. So this is the first footnote section of an article on mountvernon.org on Freemasonry, written by Mark Tabbert. And it's got a notes section in it. And you've got all of Mark's sources that he wrote for that broad brush overview article on Freemasonry, just line by line by line. And it makes me so happy because I can see where Mark got his information and trace his thought process through the paper because of that. Reliability and credibility. Are the quotes, the information, are the assertions backed by sources? Did the author just make it up? Is the author just going stream of consciousness without actually backing anything up by credible information? Why should anyone believe the website? Like, is this is this a scholarly website, or is it Illuminati conspiracies.com or something like that? What institution, if any, supports this information? We look back at the Arlington Catholic Herald article, and you realize, okay, that is an article written by a Catholic priest with the support of the Catholic Church. Based on that institutional support of that information, what biases might or might not be present? Again, I'm not calling it a bad article. Not calling it a good article. It's just, you can use it any way you want to in your research, as long as you understand the biases that are present and those biases impact how you use it. So, you look at this particular page, freemasonry.bcy.ca, you see it's the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon. It's a primer on the Bavarian Illuminati. Now, this Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon is another great website, just like Masonic Lodge of Education or Phoenix Masonry, where you can get a bunch of really awesome articles. And one of the things that I absolutely love about this website is almost all of those articles that they list list their source citations. And with this Bavarian Illuminati primer, I'm super excited because not only does Trevor list the sources that he cited, not only in an endnotes section, but also inline links and citations, but he breaks out his sources into primary and secondary sources. Now, it shouldn't be a big deal because you can tell pretty quickly which sources are primary and which sources are secondary. But to me, just the fact that he said, okay, here are the actual primary source documents that I used in compiling this information. I mean, it shows me that he took the extra effort to help make it exceedingly clear to the folks who are reading it where he got his information. And that to me lends a little bit of credibility right off the bat. Currency. And this is one of the last things we'll talk about tonight, because I know I've been rambling on for a bit. Currency. Is the information up to date? Does it need to be kept up to date? When was the information last updated? What was going on in the context of when this article was written? It's like, oh, I've found a lot of references to Freemasonry, a lot of articles written about Freemasonry in the 1830s, late 1830s, and they all think they all say Freemasonry is terrible. Like, well, that was during the height of one of the anti-Masonic periods. Go figure. That's extra context that can help you analyze and examine why a source might have a certain bias. This is a news article that almost got me last year. Apparently, back in 2004, there was like a fellowcraft club, which was an unsanctioned club, meeting in a lodge in New York. And the initiation ritual involved firing a gun point blank at a candidate. Of course, the gun was supposed to have blanks. It was loaded, and the candidate for this little unsanctioned side whatever was killed. And so somebody sent this to me last year, the year before, back when we were still doing Masonic news on the Masonic Roundtable. I was like, holy crap, candidate gets killed in New York. We got to talk about this. And I think it was Robert Johnson who was like, again? This happened like 10 years ago. And so I went to the date on the article, published 2004. And Robert, by just adding a little bit of context and critical thinking, saved me from an embarrassing YouTube episode, because I just didn't look at the currency of the information in the article that was presented. Have you ever seen an article shared on Facebook that was just so ludicrous it got your blood boiling, and then like a political article, and you realize it's from like 2016 or 2006, 2004, somewhere like during an election year, and you're just like, oh, I got upset over nothing. There are some sources where the currency isn't nearly as much of a big deal. You talk about Mackey, Wilmshurst, a lot of the earlier Masonic authors. You don't expect someone to go back and keep those sources up to date, but you still need to know the historical context behind the times in which those authors were writing, because that'll help you with your research. So if you just take time to take 5 minutes to do a little bit of extra fact checking, source checking, and critical thinking, you're going to find that you're going to be able to use your sources in widely different ways to contribute to a really, really strong, logically sound paper, which is ultimately what you want to have. So tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. I really appreciate everybody coming out to hang out with me tonight. We started off by talking a little bit about what Masonic education is, and why I'm so interested in Masonic education, and why Masonic education is such a big deal when it comes to Freemasonry. We talked a little bit about the levels of research, anecdotal or experiential research based on one's own personal experiences, very much a single data point. And then another level of research, which is empirical or data-driven research, and that's, Masonic scholarship today really shows up in those two areas. And again, one's not worse than the other, or one's not better than the other necessarily. It's just how you use them in formulating your own opinions and your own research that's key. We've gone through the research cycle as well, talking about sticking to a topic that you're interested in, starting broad, narrowing it down by using something like a mind map or an outline, filling it in incrementally, giving yourself a break when you proofread, getting some other folks to proofread it for you, and then finally sharing it with your brethren. And we've taken a look at how you can apply just maybe 5 minutes of critical thinking to really, really increase the quality of your research based on the sources that you're choosing to use and how you're choosing to use your sources in writing a paper and or giving a presentation. And this is all just to foot stomp the idea that you might have been entered as an apprentice yesterday. You might have been in the lodge for 50 years. I don't care who you are. Anybody can contribute to Masonic education. You can and should contribute to Masonic education, because that is how we make ourselves better and how we improve ourselves in Masonry. And that is why it's so incredibly important to me that we get as many folks out there, just involving themselves actively in Masonic education. It's so critical to our organization and our fraternity. And I think it's what's really going to keep us alive for the next couple hundred years. So with that, we'll move over to questions. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right, so in the Zoom room, what do we have as far as questions, guys? Do we have any from you first, and then we can go to the YouTube?
Well, I would just say thank you, first off, Brother Jason. That was amazing. Really good presentation. I think you nailed it. I've been doing research all my life to some degree, sometimes more formally, and sometimes less formally. But I mean, all the stuff you covered, you really were comprehensive. And I really wish my 10-year-old son had joined to learn a little bit more about research. It was excellent. But a question, or maybe a reflection about the empirical versus anecdotal research, that made me think in terms of, as a Mason, symbolically, like this dichotomy, anytime you got a dichotomy like that, it's going to remind you of different things. And I thought of, maybe right brain and left brain, and maybe right brain people would be more around the anecdotal research, and left brain more logical, analytical, using reason would be more inclined to empirical research. Then I started thinking about the two pillars, and anyway, I got lost. So any thoughts on that?
So the Masonic Roundtable did a really interesting article. Yeah. Too much editing on the brain. TMR did a really interesting episode with former brother Anthony Mongelli, who wrote The Craftsman's Symbology, Selected Symbols of the Entered Apprentice Degree. And we did it on empirical versus anecdotal research. And one of the things that he drove home was, even when you're doing something that's very right-brained, very esoteric, very, very related to symbology and the interpretation of symbolism, your own experience and your own personal interpretation can only carry you so far. And at some point, you made the argument, there is a wrong way to interpret symbols. And you need to do your research on the history of symbols, how others have interpreted them, to drive toward a data-centric look at symbolic interpretation as you add on to inform, and as you add on your own level of personal symbolic interpretation. So, I mean, it's a divided concept. I think there's a way to get data driven to just about everything outside of perhaps a personal memoir or something of that nature. So, I mean, I referenced Charles Harper. who did Freemasonry and Black and White in a Spurious State of Confusion. I absolutely love his books. Fascinating read. That's, it's anecdotal research. It's his own personal story. Now, how do you make that data driven? What you do is you expand that out and you get the personal stories of other Masons who have had similar journeys, who grew up in clandestine lodges, who left their clandestine lodges and joined, other grand lodges, and you get their other stories and their other anecdotes. And after a while, you begin compiling data so that you can see trends, do statistical analyses, things like that. That's how you go from an anecdotal research paper to a data-driven research paper using just collections of anecdotes, because statistical research is just a large enough sample size of anecdotes, essentially.
If I could add on to that a little bit, this is, I guess, more more ramblings than a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I'm a psychology guy. I did my master's in international diplomacy, and I am near finished with a PsyD in IO psychology. But I just there's not much more that's been done in the esoteric research field. There's not as much done as could be. The young did quite a bit as far as study of archetypes, and then the field of depth psychology kind of covers it, but it doesn't really get into it as much as it could. A lot of the esoteric sciences that we know of today, at one point in history, were considered science. They were treated as regular science, and I think quite a bit of research has been either discredited or lost, and definitely not very much has been done in those fields, at least within the last 250 to 300 years, probably not since before the Dark Ages. You'd have to go into when it was literally became illegal to do that kind of research in those fields. You'd have to probably learn Arabic and go to the Middle East and research some of those paper holdings to get into that work. But I think there's more that could be done, quantitative or even qualitative research in different esoteric fields and their impact either on the individual for making men better, or making organizational performance even. And there are massive research gaps that could be addressed in those fields, but there aren't a lot of people that are picking that up and running with it. And I think a good approach to it would be in the same way that research has been done in the field of political psychology or even experimental psychology. I know that there's not hardly anyone in Masonry that's doing that as far as I know.
Yeah, it's funny. Gerald Post was one of my graduate professors, and he pioneered very much the field of political psychology.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's, when you get into esoteric research, it's, it's interesting because for me, being a historian, esoterics are hard.
Yeah.
Like I just recently started getting into it, and I tell you what, it'll be years before I do a presentation or give a paper that's deeply inherently esoteric, just because it's not the way my brain works.
Well, it's even to get a fundamental knowledge, or at a personal level, in a field like Kabbalah or tarot or astronomy or alchemy or any of those what I would call the more occult arts and sciences, You know, it takes years to be able to do it where you're not a danger to yourself and or others, just at the individual level. And then you'd have to get to the point where you could, you know, experiment, or teach others to do that. And so it takes a long time, and there are not many people within the Masonic uh, fraternity that have done that deep dive. But it could be done. It hasn't. I know that some other occult orders have members who are professional licensed clinical psychologists that provide those services to their members as a member, but also, you know, they do the mental health checks with them, but they also, you know, do other research into some of the occult fields. But, you know, for pure Masonic, it hasn't been done, but I think it could be, because the goals of those, here's the rambling part, or that was the rambling part. Of those arts and sciences is not to learn it for the sake of learning, but it's for self-improvement and organizational improvement, and, you know, betterment of ultimately mankind, spiritual development. There's a lot of different reasons for that, and, you know, I would think that some of the goals of research could be on the how and the why and the effectiveness of performance. But anyway,
Awesome. No, thank you very much, Tim. That was really insightful, and you know, I always love hearing your perspective, because you and I just think about things so differently. All right, so we'll go over to. I actually have a couple questions that some brethren sent me, and so I'll go through those two, and then we can open it back up to either the YouTube chat or the folks on the Zoom call.
Hey, Jason, real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in. Hey, great job. And if I was thinking, what if you can't find enough resources or research and about your topic? Then what do you do? And the first thing not to do is make it up, right?
Yes.
Or be very clear when you're switching from here are the facts and here's what I think, right? Or so don't just present everything together as if it's all fact. Make sure you're very clear to your audience, like, here's what I was able to get, and then here's where I'm still unsure and I couldn't find primary sources, and so I can only speculate on this portion here, but we know this is true. I think that's a key thing, that some people are not going to get all the information they want to get to tell a compelling story or whatever, to have some good conclusion. So don't make it up.
Yes, that's awesome. And so I've talked time and time again, alluded to, okay, you want to vet your sources. It's not because they're bad sources, but it might change the way you look at them or might change the way you use them. That's the same thing for absence and or plethora of information. So there are defined limits to historical knowledge. It's one of the things that was beaten into my head in school. Historians deal with limits of historical knowledge. We don't have all the information. We also have way too much information, some of which might be credible, might not. And we have to sift through all of that and figure out to the best of our abilities what is and what isn't. And at the end of the day, you lay out your own assumptions and your own biases, and the best thing you can do is be upfront with your reader or your listener to say, hey, you know, this is the information that I got. This is where I think it's credible. And so this next section, there's just not a lot of information out here. So this is my interpretation of, you know, what might be or whatnot. Or you could say, you know, the only source that I have is this particular source. So this source is saying this. However, this, and this might be drivers that are biasing this source to say this based on this. And so that's all really good information to give your listener and give your reader, because again, you know, we just, it's easy to take things at face value. And you can't take anything at face value because somebody's always writing something for a purpose. And it doesn't have to be, it's not a nefarious purpose per se, but there's always a purpose behind why somebody's writing something or saying something. And the more you understand about that, the better your analysis of that source will be. So thanks, John. That was awesome. One of the questions that I got online beforehand is, let's see, I've written several papers for school and such, but they've all been with a prompt or oriented to a topic. How should I select what to write about? Based on my educational background, I feel like a research paper should seek to answer a question. How do I decide what question to answer? So you can have different purposes for writing a paper. Seeking to answer a question, could be one of those. You could be trying to close a gap in knowledge. You could simply be just informing somebody about a paper topic. You could be trying to persuade someone with an argument. You can answer a question, you can close a gap in knowledge, but you don't have to. As far as what to research, I go back to my chart where it says pick a topic you're interested in. If you've got a facet of Freemasonry that you're really interested in and that you just keep getting drawn to, start there. And as you research, you'll find other pieces of Freemasonry that really resonate with you. And you open up, places for other places for discussion and research. So we had a brother in the Zoom chat ask, how do I know when to stop researching? And that's a really interesting question. And honestly, I presented this at the Kansas Lodge of Research back last week, and a similar question came up. A lot of times it's just a judgment call. So if you go back to the outline that I did, where everything's kind of built out modularly, I did that so that I can scale it up or down based on the requirements for paper length or presentation length. So a lot of my presentations that I do, I can scale down to about 15 minutes and I can scale up to over an hour. And it's just because I've made them more or less modular so that I can pull out pieces and plug pieces back in. And so if you listen to this talk by me next year, it's going to be completely different because I continually rework my presentations based on new information, based on newly vetted information, things of that nature. So really, you could spend your entire life researching a topic and never actually complete it. But at some point, you have to make the judgment call to say, you know what, that's good enough. And I know that's not particularly helpful of an answer, but if you run through a paper and you've got 5 pages and you think it covers down really well, another good use of proofreaders is to say, okay, what am I missing? Or am I presenting too much information? Your proofreaders might come back and say, you know what, you didn't talk about this. Or they might say, you know what, you just got way too much information in there, I can't follow it. Why don't you take this, this, and this out? And you can have your brethren guide you on what a good stopping point or what a good pause might be for research, because you never truly stop learning, you never truly stop researching. You just put it on pause so that you can focus on something else, as you'll always have the opportunity to come back to it. Another question that I've gotten is, often we see a historical figure quoted as being a Mason, some even from the last century. Sometimes a lodge or dates of being a member are not given. I am doing a research paper on the influence of Masonic ritual on scouting ceremonies. How would one go about trying to find a proper record for proof of membership? Masons are not the best at keeping good records. I've gone through enough Grand Lodge proceedings over all the states of the United States to know that we're not great when it comes to keeping records and data. And as you get back into the 1900s and the 1800s, it gets harder and harder and harder to find data, especially when you get these folks who were supposedly Masons, like Thomas Jefferson. Some say he was a Freemason. We don't have any evidence that that he actually was, even though I just offended like a bunch of people there. But one of the ways that that you can bonus off of work that other people have been doing is by looking at genealogy websites. So there are a ton of folks who are really, really interested in their ancestry, their family history, and their genealogy. And so if you're looking up a particular person, whether he be like the founder of your town or some local hero or someone else, a lot of times you can go to a genealogy website and you might have folks who are direct descendants of that person who have been commenting on Ancestry or other places. You might actually be able to go to ask if they have any evidence of this person's Masonic or fraternal affiliation. It's a good place to start. And my camera just died. So we'll try it again. There we go. That's a good place to start. So what other questions do y'all have? All right, so Brother Sean says, any TMR thoughts on the amount of lazy scholarship? Old and off-cited sources in our body of study can be riddled with inaccuracies that are accepted as fact by those not truly doing the work. Lazy scholarship exists everywhere. That's why we have peer reviewing of sources. And unfortunately, in Freemasonry, there's not a lot of peer reviewing. Not as much as academia. So, if you have someone who's published on Lulu Press, Vice, Cambridge University Press, with the Cambridge University Press, they've gone through a rigorous editing process. Now, there are plenty of folks who have self-published on Lulu Press who have made, amazing contributions to Freemasonry, like Brother James Morgan has put out an amazing book that he self-published that was awesome. So I'm not saying that that Lulu Press is bad. I'm just saying it doesn't hold up to the peer reviewing rigor that you would find at like a Cambridge University Press publishing company or something like that. And it's really, really easy to publish. Anybody can get on social media today and write a blog entry. You got guys like Kevin Homan, thinks he can write a blog article. It's I love you, Kevin. Anybody can write on on Masonic scholarship, or can do Masonic scholarship today. And my camera has decided to die, but that's all right. It's just important, again, not to take things at face value. And unfortunately, we don't have a good method of sifting through the chaff to find the good stuff in scholarship. You just have to go through it and the best you can, and validate and vet your sources every time. Yeah, there's always going to be bad information and bad scholarship out there. The best thing you can do to make sure that you don't fall into that category is don't take anything at face value and vet your sources. So Brother Nick has asked, Jason, is it a good idea to research Masonry and ritual before becoming a Freemason? Or would it make it anticlimactic when you actually become one and learn it from the lodge itself? So for me, I'm going to say, you can get a very, very, very high level organization of perhaps the history of the organization, or a high level view of the history of the organization. if you want, but I wouldn't research anything about the ritual before you actually go through it. And John, you've raised your hand, so I'm going to let you add to this and take anything you want.
Yeah, it's just really hard to separate what's true and what's not. That's the real reason. Anything that's out there that might be spoilers all come from different sources. So it might be a spoiler in one state and it might not be in your state. So yeah, it's just better to just go through your Grand Lodge's initiation process, so you know what is real according to your jurisdiction, and then you have some sort of foundation to base all of your sources off of, right? They're not saying that they're wrong, but they're different, and so um, it's not really much of a spoiler thing. It's more which it is. I mean, initiation's awesome, and it's better to have a foundation before you can separate that. So um, it's like reading a poet write about love. If you've never been in love, you really don't know. You can kind of get the metaphors, but you really won't understand it until you've gone through it.
So I rescind my answer and yield to John's answer. Don't do research until you become a Mason. Another really good question from Brother Sean is, can you share the differences, if any, between historical research and philosophical research? I find that here in Connecticut, most research is driven by history as opposed to novel study or new information. So for me, again, admittedly, esoterics is not my strength. Philosophy, yeah, until you get into the overtly mystical aspects of it. But you're going to find with just about any topic that you research, whether it's historical or philosophical, man's ideas about those philosophies have changed over time. So what I mean by that is, if you were to explore Immanuel Kant as a philosopher, you would start by taking a look at his early works and then filter through his later works, and then you would take a look at any revisions that have been done to his philosophical paradigms after his death, and by doing so you can trace a history of his philosophy and his ideas. So for me, and just because it's my own bias being a historian, philosophy, history permeates everything, just because unless something is brand new and we've never experienced it before, man's ideas about a topic have changed over time, and man's ways of conceptualizing, visualizing, depicting a topic have changed over time. So that topic has history. And, if you write about something that's never been written before, congratulations, you just started the history of that topic. So for me, I know this isn't what you're getting at, but, anything you do with esoterics and philosophy, to me, the history is a very important component, because in order to identify where something is today, and how we think of a symbol or an esoteric concept today, you have to trace how our conceptualization or conceptual framework of this item has changed over time, and why we no longer believe that this concept or this philosophy equates to this. This is a good question. Thanks for your presentation and the information on JSTOR. Can you recommend any other reference or research sites? So JSTOR is great. If you are a student, you can have access to WorldCat, WORLDCAT, which is the World Catalog. Again, another lifesaver in college. All monographs and books and scholarly articles pretty much ever written. You can check out the Library of Congress as well, just to get some ideas for different things that are out there. As far as things that are online, you can take a look at the old charges for some really good early primary sources on stonemasons and the history of masonry. You can look at sacred texts, which is the Sacred Text Archive. I think it's sacred-text.com, I think. And it's got all of these religious texts and a lot of older Masonic authors like Wilmshurst and Mackey. You can look at Google Scholar, scholar.google.com. And honestly, I don't necessarily go for collections of articles just to see, what might be interesting. If I'm doing in-depth research, like most peer-reviewed articles, I mean, they're like 20, 30 pages, and they're very difficult to get through and very, very highly specialized. I don't have time to weed through all of that information. So if I'm looking to narrow my focus and get really detailed information, I'm going to do a search on something like Google Scholar, or look through the old charges, or find some other means like WorldCat of searching for my subject, and then look at the article abstracts to see what actually has information that's relevant to me. And you'll find that just by searching scholar.google.com or going to WorldCat, you're going to find a whole wealth of information, and a lot of it's not going to be anything relevant to what you necessarily are looking for, but some of it will be. I did some research on Russian Freemasonry for TMR episode, because I've always been fascinated with the culture and the history. And I did scholar.google.com and came up with some really, really interesting monographs or books, essentially, on the history of Freemasonry in Russia. So unfortunately, a lot of them were in Russian, and I don't speak Russian, but it's still really good. So let's see. I think we'll close with this comment and let everybody get back to their evenings. But we'll close with Brother Kevin, who said, one point I would ask you to expand upon is how to actually present your paper and keep your audience interested. I assume you don't just read it, or perhaps that would be Research 102. And yeah, that, I kind of did a cop-out when I did part 6 of the research process. Present it, okay, I'm out. And that's just because that's another hour and a half presentation in and of itself on how to keep your audience interested, how to present with confidence, how to ensure that you're not just simply reading your paper, that you're giving good eye contact, that you're familiar enough with your subject matter. It's another entire presentation. But I just wanted to I just wanted to get us through the paper writing process, so that you have something to present. And then maybe Masonic Research 102 will be how to brief or how to present your paper, because I've done a lot of research, done a lot of writing, done a lot of presenting. So it's there's an art to it, and I draw stick figures when it comes to it. So with that, I'll close down the YouTube stream, but just wanted to say thank you so much, everybody, for being awesome, and for sticking with me for over an hour and a half. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this persuades you and serves as a catalyst for you to go out and do your own Masonic research. Because we're all at home. We've all, some of us don't have a lot of time on our hands with kids running around, but try to learn something new and try to share that information with your brethren, and you'll be contributing to Masonic research, which is just incredibly, incredibly needed and incredibly important in today's day and age. So thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it.